Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and we're about to begin tonight's event, or this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are. It is entitled A Transatlantic Reckoning, What the 2025 U.S. National Security Strategy Means for Europe. And we are joined by an outstanding group of scholars, practitioners, and scholar practitioners, and I will introduce them in just a moment. All of their biographies in greater detail are on our website, but I'm particularly pleased that we have a wonderful mix of Academy alumni. We have an Academy trustee, and we even have some future visitors to the Academy participating in this event. I'm hugely grateful that they were available on such a short notice, and I'm really delighted that they will be offering their insights into what it is we have before us in terms of the Trump White House's 2025 national security strategy. I think it's fair to say that at least here in Europe, on December 4th, the strategy did not just drop, but actually detonated with a really resounding bang. And that document, much shorter than most national security strategies and incorporating elements, I think, unlike ones we have seen in the past, seems to herald all kinds of major shifts in U.S. foreign and security policy and presents all kinds of challenges for European economic and security policy. The implications of this policy were such that we felt we needed to organize a kind of rapid response event to discuss it in its totality. And we want to pay special attention to the implications for Europe, the Transatlantic Alliance, and for Germany. Let me just briefly introduce our speakers. I'll do it in alphabetical order. First, we have Stephen Biegun, former United States Deputy Secretary of State. He served in the first Trump administration. I'm delighted that he is a future visitor to the Academy, and we look forward to welcoming Steve here in February. Emily Haber is the former ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany in the United States. She is an Academy trustee. She has been state secretary at both Germany's Foreign Office and its Home Office, its Interior Ministry. Mara Karlin is a two-time distinguished visitor at the Academy. She is professor at the Foreign Policy Institute of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. She is a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, and she has been an integral part of the programming we have done here on European security. Finally, William Walforth is the Daniel Webster Professor of Government at Dartmouth College. He is a veteran Russia watcher and an expert on American grand strategy. He doesn't know yet in what capacity he is coming, but he is definitely coming to the Academy in the near future. So anyway, I'm going to just kick this off by asking, first of all, Emily Haber to set the table for us and to describe the reaction that the national security strategy provoked here in Germany, and to tell us what she makes of it. As a matter of background, it's worth noting that Emily was Germany's representative in Washington through Donald Trump's first term in office, and therefore has a lot of relevant experience for exactly this conversation. Emily, why don't you tell us about how you found the national security strategy and what you're hearing?
Well, I'm not going to say how I found the national strategy. You said, Dan, it detonated, and it's certainly true that the reaction in Germany and in Europe was one of outrage and of shock, mainly around the contempt that was directed against Europe and European institutions, the attacks on European democracies, the silence on the Russia threat, and the naked transactionalism and quest for dominance that transpired in the strategy. But it's worth to note that the official reaction was somewhat muted. It's true, the Chancellor publicly said that parts of the strategy were not acceptable to Europe and that European democracies were capable to protect themselves. And the foreign minister said something on the lines that Europe was able to protect its own freedom of speech. But other than that, they or their spokespersons underline the relevance of transatlantic cooperation. And there is a reason for that. While the readers of the strategy might have found, or will have found the language and the clarity shocking, on the substance, well, it wasn't such a surprise. The writing had been on the wall for months. Now, while this national security strategy is really a departure from all previous national security strategies, in it we see reflected the patterns we've seen in political developments over the past 11 months, to wit, the policy maximalism wherever possible and to the extent possible. We've seen how the administration has targeted, in particular, allies and partners because the degree of dependencies and interconnectivity provided levers that could be used and capitalized for sometimes short-term gains. There was a mechanism in play which included the escalation dominance with little risk. And that was not the case with regard to countries like China, the geopolitical peer that was able to extract huge concessions and pains and was superbly prepared and in the end forced America to back down. So power maximalism to the extent possible and wherever possible. That's one of the continuous threads of the strategy, and explains why Latin America and the Western Hemisphere and Europe are very much targeted, whereas there is a significant silence on the strategic challenge of, say, China, or other than in economic terms, or Russia, let alone North Korea. Then the sphere of interest policy, we've seen that in how the administration had dealt with Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, now Colombia, Panama, and so forth. The mercantilization of security, also one of the continuous threats of the national security strategy. Well, that had been apparent in dealing with alliances in Asia and the Pacific. It's evident that it has become evident over the past month that America is changing the alliance bargain. Alliance bargains in the past had been rooted in shared threats, in shared values, and this is now being replaced by the expectation that allies massively invest into the revitalization of the American industrial base. That was visible with regard to Japan and South Korea. It is now visible too with regard to Europe. I direct you to point 10 of the 28-point plan, which explicitly says that a security guarantee needs to be compensated. This too is a constant theme of the security strategy. And the last point, the attacks on rules-based systems, on multilateralism, on governance, a constant theme over the past 11 months, and now reflected in the strategy as well. We've seen how they talked and heard how Europe has been talked about by the administration. We've heard it in speeches. We've heard it in the Munich speech. We've seen to what extent the administration has reached out to right-wing and extremist populist actors in Europe. All of that has been the writing on the wall. So my point here is the NSS is not really the turning point that people make out it is. It is in comparison to earlier strategies, but not in terms of the of political steps and moves that have been taken since January this year. It doesn't mean it's prescriptive necessarily, and I think we'll see wide policy moves and swings in the time to come. We've seen to what extent the president is not letting himself be scripted. But all in all, there are parameters in place. They will not go away, and we can read them in the strategy. Now, on the longer term reaction, I think what we'll see in Europe is that countries will be inclined not to overstate public criticism or use counterproductive rhetoric that could derail possible cooperation in areas of strategic urgency or in areas of shared interest. After all, this is an existential time of transition for Europe. And there will be there's a conversation to be had, not only on burden shifting and burden sharing. It will include many other topics, ranging from capabilities and greater European centrality in NATO and so forth. And a transition that will not happen overnight, and that will be that will entail a greater risk and a greater exposure than Europe has seen since the end of the end of the Cold War, which makes it imperative to contain antagonism in the antagonisms in the transatlantic environment. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. So a bundling of lots of themes and strands that we've been hearing for a long time, certainly throughout this administration, possibly even back into Trump 1 Mara. You're the one with strategy in your former title. And you have presided over the writing of all kinds of strategy documents at the Pentagon. Tell us, as someone who is familiar with the long sweep of American strategy, what you think of this document and what makes it distinctive.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan. It's lovely to be here. And I have indeed worked on a number of these strategies, national security strategies. I ran the last national defense strategy. And my takeaway is similar to Ambassador Haber's. This is shocking, but not surprising. If you've been paying attention since Vice President Vance gave his speech at Munich in February, and if you've been watching the actions of the administration, then you really shouldn't be in any way astonished by the words here. I have to give the Trump administration real credit on this strategy. And I'll tell you why. This is an honest strategy. So in 2017, the Trump administration put out a strategy in which the audio and the video kind of didn't match, right? They were taking a bunch of non-traditional anomalous actions. And the strategy they wrote is one that was pretty in line with the US approach to the world since, the last kind of 70 or so, 80 or so years. That is not the case right now, and that's why I give them credit. This is a very honest and frank strategy. It's clear about their priorities, the Western Hemisphere and migration. It's clear about how they think about traditional U.S. adversaries or challengers. So Russia, pretty friendly toward Russia. That makes sense if you see how the administration has engaged with Moscow. China is really largely viewed through economic terms. That also makes sense when you look at the efforts at deep cooperation with China and a real kind of disinterest in the security threat they pose to Indo-Pacific security and stability, and arguably more broadly. If you look at how America's allies and partners are treated writ large, they're kind of more seen as a net burden. And that's not just the case in Europe. It's also the case in Asia as well. And look, let's just dive into the European section for a moment. Some of it are things you're used to hearing about. Too much regulation, increase your defense budgets. Absolutely. We've seen that time and time again. And yet, there's a very big push that's effectively mucking around in domestic European affairs, looking internally and almost endorsing a certain approach, a certain set of political views that are seen as pretty far right. That in and of itself is pretty non-traditional. So I would wrap by saying this is a good strategy insofar as it tells you what the administration's actions have been and are likely to continue to be. That said, these strategies almost never affect budgets compared to like defense strategies, for instance. So don't go looking around per se to see how resource allocations might change.
Okay, Mara, thank you very much. Let's turn to Steve Began. Steve, as a veteran government official, I want to pick up on Mara's point. Should anyone really care about a national security strategy? I was involved in writing a couple back in the 90s, and I don't think anyone remembers them. And particularly, because the president is well known to change his mind until he decides on where he wants to go. How much of this is a blueprint for where the administration is going to go? And then finally, the cast of characters. This is a long way from the 2017 first term national security strategy. What can you tell us about how we got from there to here?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Dan, and great to be with you. And we do share a credential. I held the pen for the 2002 National Security Strategy by President Bush, released in September of 2002. Also, probably largely forgotten, memorable maybe for two concepts. One was a novel definition of what preemption would be in the case of a country on the cusp of developing weapons of mass destruction, and also noteworthy for the muscular U.S. commitment to maintain military superiority over all adversaries. That gives me a certain perspective and even empathy for the debate around this most recent national security strategy, largely because it in a different context and in a different era, it has many of the same attributes. That there was a lot of excitement and polarization and challenges and complaint and I think to that extent the authors of it will take some satisfaction in having stirred the pot and started the debate. To your specific question, should this be taken seriously? Absolutely, it should be taken seriously. But it in the context that the president's former campaign manager Kellyanne Conway once, I think, very usefully described, is that the president's critics tend to take him literally but not seriously, and the president's supporters take him seriously but not literally. So I would take this very seriously as an expression of presidential worldview. I do think, like Mara, that this is a much more accurate representation of President Trump's worldview than the 2017 national strategy. But I also wouldn't take it literal. I wouldn't parse every word, and I wouldn't assume the United States is going to be able to put resources behind every one of these initiatives. The document professes to desire to get away from an unattainable set of objectives, and yet it has huge aspirations for a presidency that has just slightly more than 3 years left. And so take it seriously, but don't take it literally. I think it meets some really important necessary requirements. It's readable, it's coherent, and here I'd make an appeal to anybody listening who's reacting or responding to this national security strategy. You may hate it more after you do it, but you must read it. You have to read the document. Don't simply rest on the accounts of commentators or the excerpts that are pulled out. Read it in its totality to understand the context and the coherence which it has. I think anybody who comments on this, and that's a minimum obligation, is that you have to read the entire thing, not just excerpts. And so, what does it mean in the long run? It certainly is an effort to reflect the president's worldview, as I said. But as is always the case with any administration, but particularly in the Trump administration, it's also an effort to capture, and I mean in the truest sense of the word, capture the president's voice. In other words, not what he said, but what he means. And we'll see in time if this is what the president means. President Trump, I think, would never call himself a strategist. He is much more contextual. He's reactive. He goes by gut. President Trump will not be sitting at the resolute desk in the Oval Office, poised to make a decision and asked to review his national security strategy once more to make sure that the actions he's taking are consistent with that strategy. He would never, frankly, no president would ever be constrained with that. It's also important for another reason. The development of a national security strategy, for you who worked on these, for Mara who worked on these, the development of a national security strategy is a tool to reconcile views inside the administration. And that's very important, particularly in the Trump administration, which has veered sharply away from having an interagency process where it resolves those. And I actually didn't find the Europe section to be the most interesting, although the Europe section is certainly bracing and shocking, and particularly for people who haven't been paying attention to what President Trump has been saying about U.S.-European relations for the last decade. But to me, it's the Asia section that's most interesting, because here the administration is least reconciled on what its strategic objectives are. And my sense from reading and rereading the section on Asia and on China specifically is that it's been somewhat tortured by trying to resolve disagreements inside the administration. And that's not by accident, because the administration does not have one view on China. The president has a view on China, and the document is, to a significant extent, reflective of that presidential view. But buried inside that section are a lot of different competing agendas, which will be very hard for the United States to reconcile in the near term and in the medium term with China, not the least because China gets a vote in this as well.
I'm glad you made the point about the internal utility of a national security strategy. It is a good way of setting signposts for the thousands of people who work in an administration. And I think you're exactly right on the China piece. Of course, for a long time, the president was proud of saying that he was the person who awoke the country to the threat of China. And it was such a big part of the 2017 strategy. There has been news reporting that I think the ambivalence or the internal tensions that you've detected in the Asia section was the result of the uncertainty of our negotiations with China over trade and the desire of some senior officials to prevent those from going off the tracks. But you tell me if if you think that is misplaced.
Yeah, well, I think you actually described it quite well, Dan. And understanding how China policy is considered in the Trump administration, you have to think about the Trump world, because there are several influences inside that Trump world. There's the business community, there's labor unions, there's trade protectionists, there's corporate executives and who both have offensive interests and defensive concerns about China. And then, of course, you have the MAGAverse, you have human rights voices, you have the normative values do still seep in to the debate over China policy. You have all those forces, and then, of course, experts, former diplomats, interests of allies, partners, and friends around the world. All that is a kind of a stew that's the Trump worldview of China. But separate and distinct from all that is President Trump's view. And that is significantly reflected in this document. But there's an effort to reconcile all those other competing views at the same time, which, quite honestly, is going to be a real challenge for the administration. Because right now, President Trump may have authored the shift in U.S. policy towards China. That may or may not be true. But what is true for sure is during his presidency, there was a convergence of all those different groups towards a much more skeptical and even hostile view towards China. Business leaders, because they were being maltreated in the Chinese economy, labor unions because they compete with Chinese labor, et cetera. President Trump presides or leads that uneasy convergence of forces, which will splinter in the wake of an agreement with China. uh, along the lines of what the broad strokes of this policy call for. I think the president's aspirations for the U.S.-China relationship are quite clear. The degree to which that view is reflected in the Pentagon, in the intelligence community, in the State Department, not to mention all the other voices that contribute and influence the president's decisions, I think we're a long way away from a consensus.
Right. Bill Walforth, you have been studying and writing about American grand strategy for many years, and you're also a Russia expert. I am wondering if, from your perspective, the verdict of one commentator, Tom Wright, writing in the Atlantic, is appropriate. It misses the challenges. It misses the threats to us, and particularly in terms of how it deals with Russia and China. I mean, there's some irony here. The 2017 document and also the defense strategy at the time were given a lot of credit for saying, "Hey, we have great power rivalry again. We've gone down the rat hole of the war on terror, but while we weren't looking, these countries have started to pose a significant threat to our interests all around the world." And yet here we are, and it sounds like we're in a different universe. I'm curious what your take is.
Well, I think the document does warrant reading, and I agree with everything that's been said so far. In a lot of these online meetings, one is distracted, maybe looking at one's own notes, but I've been listening rapidly what's been said so far and have been found it very instructive. But I do think you've really hit the nail on the head here about this document, which is it restates traditional American grand strategic aspirations to prevent hegemony in any of the key regions of the world. It says, even as the United States itself abjures, I don't know what it calls it, but abjures the quixotic quest for a global hegemony for itself, it will seek to prevent hegemony and even regional hegemony by any other potential aspirant. That's a very traditional statement of American grand strategy. What it doesn't state is which countries are actually constitute those threats to those various regions. And I have to here read between the lines. It almost seems as if the document is expressing the idea that maybe the United States and the other major powers can come to terms in some ways, reflecting the sphere of influence concept that's been mentioned already. There's been some reporting about a previously circulated, classified, and longer version of this document, talking about a kind of re-envisioned G7 that would instead include the United States and Russia and China, as well as a couple of other states that are regarded by the administration as serious players. And so the document may be suggesting that it can have its cake and eat it, namely maintain the traditional American focus on preventing regional hegemony in key areas of the world, while at the same time reaching some sort of modus vivendi with the potential threats to those regions. But I want to also quickly say a word or two about the Russian reaction. For 30 years, the Russians have been touting this idea of multipolarity. It's not what we political scientists think of as multipolarity, but it adds up to a world with a dramatically reduced role for the United States, with a bunch of great powers who see each other as equals, recognizing each other's prerogatives and spheres of influence, the end of intrusive norms that undermine state sovereignty, a stress on sovereignty, but where great powers are the only countries that actually really have sovereignty. And this is a vision that is widely shared in the Russian foreign policy establishment, not just in the speeches of Vladimir Putin, as one much more congenial for Russia. But for 25 years, the Russians have been saying this is where the world is going, but America won't recognize it. America still is deluded. America still thinks it can run the world. And I believe that many Russian commentators potentially correctly see in this document a move on the part of at least portions of the American establishment towards seeing the world as the Russians do, and seeing the world moving in the direction that the Russians have for so long been saying that it's moving. And that is, even though I think most Russian commentators, analysts, and officials are quite realistic, as our previous commentators have been, about what this strategy is and isn't, and whether it is predictive. Nonetheless, I think they read it as a move of at least portion of the American political elite in the direction of seeing the world the way they do, as this concept of multipolarity.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah, sure.
I think that's a really great point, and I think you have to read the document, then you have to pull back and look at that broader scope in exactly that way. And I think some of you will have seen that President Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov has welcomed the sentiments in this document, and so there's a presumption here that this expression that was just laid out, of this being essentially a U.S. At least part of the U.S. elite shifting in that direction. The reality is it won't work, and it won't work for a couple of reasons. One is even though they will like what they hear, they won't believe it. Neither China nor Russia. Second is they know our political system well enough, and they know that presidents change and policies change, and whether they like it at this moment, they recognize that it may not be durable. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is that's not really a world they seek anyway. China and Russia don't really seek a multipolar world. They seek a world in which they are hegemons. And that is antithetical to the other parts of this strategy. And it's why any shift in the United States in the direction of multipolarity will be rejected by Russia and China, because they want hegemony. They don't want multipolarity. And so, as pleasing as it may, soothing as it may sound to them, they're not going to believe it.
Emily, you wanted to jump in here. We can't hear you. Very good.
I want to reinforce the point that Stephen has made. I agree with him that the national security strategy probably obscures the fact that there are widely differing opinions on China and on Russia, even in this administration. And the China hawks must have been shocked at reading at the framing of the Chinese challenge in the strategy. And the same is true for Russia. And that precisely is why neither China nor Russia will believe in the sustainability of that approach. But my question to the American participants is this. I don't think that there are opposing opinions on Europe and on the transatlantic relationship. When I was posted in Washington during the first Trump administration, I heard a lot of criticism on Europe, but I knew that there were many people in the administration that would tell me a completely different take on the future and the perspectives of the transatlantic relationship, much more traditional. And I would claim or ask you whether that can still be said. And I don't think it can. I think that the treatment of Europe in the Europe chapter reflects the mainstream view of this administration. So the suggestion not to take it literally, well, that's not a suggestion I would take seriously in the context of Europe. I was told time and again after the elections that we should distinguish the noise and the signal. Well, I think on Europe, the noise is the signal and the signal is the noise.
Okay, Mara, did you want to take that one on?
Yeah, I think there's a really smart point in this. There is debate in this administration on China, Russia, and the Middle East. So China, how much of a threat it is. If you're sitting in the Pentagon, it is seen as the number one threat. There is no other military in the world that can challenge the U.S. military like China, not just in Asia and more broadly. Russia, you see a lot of debate. How important is it for Ukraine to win? To what extent should the U.S. maintain assistance, et cetera, et cetera? Just kind of how significant is the future of this conflict? Middle East, there's some debate. particularly given, as you will recall, of course, this summer, the Trump administration did choose to use military force against Iran's nuclear program. And some folks in the administration will say the Middle East matters a lot, especially in economic terms, tech, and there are others who say we've spent decades and decades worried about that region. Don't do it. I think this is where Emily is spot on. There is not much debate in this administration about Europe. I think on the whole, folks there have a pretty negative view of Europe, and it is much, much bigger than spend more on defense, which, by the way, kudos to a number of countries, Germany being a leader among them, for actually finally doing that. Look, to be frank, it sure would have been nice if that had started maybe a couple of years ago instead, but such as it is, let me be clear, it did start after Putin's invasion. I wish it had started many years before that. But on Europe, unfortunately, there's a lot of concurrence with this pretty negative view across this administration.
And
So-
could I also a couple things on that?
Sure.
Emily, I get your point, and if I was sitting in Germany, I would I'd be treating this with a lot of alarm. And your question is a good question, but I think the evidence is mixed on whether or not your conclusion is correct. I mean, first, I think it's important as a matter of perspective to understand that when Americans think about Europe, they don't think the European Union instinctively. They think of the entire geography of Europe, which encompasses, depending on where you want to draw the lines, anywhere from 44 to 51 countries, and certainly includes Ukraine. In some of the more intemperate or poisonous statements about Europe are directed at the European Union as an institution, not Europe at large. That's very much harder, I think, for Europeans to see that distinction than it is for Americans to see that distinction. Because in Europe, it's commonplace to refer to the European Union as Europe. What does Europe think? What's the view of Europe? And the European Union is not Europe, and it has not been Europe ever. The second is that within that broader view of Europe, United States public opinion matters here, and American politics matter here. United States public opinion still is overwhelmingly positive in favor of NATO, for example, as a European institution, somewhere from 60 to 70%, depending on whose poll you pick. That is an extraordinarily strong consensus in the United States, higher than twice the rating of our current president, 3 times the rating of our current Congress. 60 to 70% is a remarkable consensus inside the United States of America. Likewise, if one of the centers of concern in this document is its views towards Russia and concessionary views towards Russia, just recognize that Russia's approval rating in the United States of America is 20% versus 80% negative. Within that 80% is a very strong negative. And so there are laws of politics and laws of public opinion here that will have bearing on the longer term on exactly how much of an abrupt shift this ends up being in American politics. But if I could just, for one more moment, say, I think the much more interesting question is what is Europe going to do, having heard this and having read this? That's the important question. Is Europe going to go ahead and do what it should do anyway? Because if it does, builds up its defense, for example, it's going to not only earn a greater share of voice, I think Europe is going to feel much more confident about itself in the world. And so that's a question that I think is very important for how the impact of this document, the impact of this administration's policies, the impact of President Trump's influence on U.S. relations with its neighbors. How is Europe going to react to this? That's the question I'm interested in.
So I'd like to get to that in 1 second. I just wanted to throw out a couple of things for all of you to react to. One of them, though, is sort of an affirmation of what Emily was saying before. It was striking to me how much the NSS, the National Security Strategy, seemed to be in line with both the Munich speech, but also the Signal chat that got so much attention, in which I believe it was the vice president who said, geez, I hate helping out the Europeans again. And the Secretary of Defense agreed. On the one hand, it seems like this is a direct descendant of that exchange. with its emphasis on implied European weakness. On the other hand, it is at odds with how the president has behaved an awful lot of the time, when he has actually reaffirmed the American commitment to Article 5 of the NATO treaty, and often seemed to be much more swayed by this set of European leaders than he was by those of his first term. But the other thing that I wanted to just throw out there for you to react to, when I read the Europe section, I was struck by how much it sounds exactly like the MAGA critique of where America was going, and that we are endangered by by excessive immigration. And at one point in the passage, it says that in 20 years, some European countries will be unrecognizable, and that it suggests that political correctness, I think the president said that in his Politico speech, has ruined Europe, and that DEI and other and wokeness have corrupted sort of the original essentialist nature of all these great European countries. And it struck me that this is very much what the discourse is about. What's wrong with America? And that it also suggests maybe there's an excess of democracy in both places. But I'd be curious at how you respond, Bill.
Very quickly, I think that there are people in the administration who sincerely believe that Europe will be a stronger and better allies if it's less, if you excuse the term, less woke. I mean, I just think they think deregulation, greater innovation, greater focus on sovereignty, greater the continent, of course, is already moving in this direction on immigration, but much more stringent immigration controls are necessary for the families, the whole thing. And that's their vision of what would constitute stronger allies. I think it's sincerely believed by some people. But I wanted to get back to this overall conversation about how deep and how abiding this view of Europe is. First of all, note that in the national security strategy, the traditional U.S. commitment, to preventing any dangerous hegemony over Europe is restated. In addition, the document expresses that the United States is going to continue to support its allies as they become more independent and autonomous. And finally, if you look at but it just believes, I think many people in this administration believes, that Russia does not constitute a threat that Europe is not capable of handling in due time on its own. I mean, that's their big focus. And there's a debate among experts over how rapidly the Europeans could stand up a kind of conventional deterrent on their own, and I happen to side with a more pessimistic view on how quickly Europe can do that. But that's a coherent, understandable view. And the final thing I would add to the public opinion data regarding the strength of American public support for Europe and for NATO, there's also remarkably strong support for Ukraine. And indeed, if you look at the Republican establishment, that is, say, outside the administration, my political science colleagues who study American politics do not see a sea change in Republican elite, Republican congressional and other elite views of these matters. They defer to this administration. But I still think there's more. There's not a consensus in Republican establishment on the kinds of views towards Europe, the anti-woke elements of this document that maybe that you're detecting. And so I go back to that original comment that Russia and China, but in this case Russia, would be very foolish to think that this necessarily signifies a step change, a long-term permanent change in the U.S. view towards Europe.
So, Bill, your point about preventing any intrusive hegemony by others is well taken. But at the same time, the Europe section does something that is, I think, kind of unprecedented in terms of the way it talks about intervening in the societies of allied democracies.
It is. If I could just respond to that, I just published a book on subversion in international politics, particularly subversion among great powers. And so my wonderful co-author Jill Castor and I did an extensive study of exactly this question, and the answer is setting aside politics or partisanship, the answer is yes. It's pretty much unprecedented. It goes against most understandings about proper diplomatic behavior among democratic allies. And so you can find this or that comment by an American president or administration that seems intrusive in the domestic politics, but not on the scale that it's talked about in this document.
Or openly. Yes,
Yeah,
we've done information operations in the past. The United States has, but we haven't said that we're coming to change your societies. Mara, you had your finger up.
So there's an irony here as well, which is it would seem to me that if, say, you support AFD and AFD starts to run Germany or Farage and UK or what have you, those guys aren't investing in their militaries, right? They're not actually doing the big fundamental thing that this administration wants. They're not increasing defense spending. And in fact, by alienating and pushing away US allies and partners in Europe, and I would also say in Asia, what you're encouraging them to do is wean themselves off of any relationship with the US military. That includes US defense industry, which is a really big deal, creates a whole lot of American jobs and puts a lot of money into the US economy. You're also encouraging all of these friends to find different friends, right? Either across their own region or other regions as well. Effectively, you make yourself less and less relevant by taking the approach that the administration has done.
Emily, you wanted to say something as well, I thought.
I think it's a fact that the culture wars have percolated down into the transatlantic relationship. Didn't happen it didn't come with the national security strategy. It's older, but I think it's fair to say that this is something we had not seen during the first Trump administration. That's a new phenomenon. And it will alter the way that people discuss about Europe or about Germany for that matter, if European countries have come to be associated with one camp of the American political landscape. I always thought that was a huge risk. I do admit that Europeans have contributed to that development, but it will alter the pulse aspect that both of you have mentioned. My second point is, yes, even though the strategy is not a massive change in substance as compared to what we've seen over the past months, it will probably have a seismic effect on how we think about our own future. And I think it will lead to a whole new set of conversations on what Europe needs to be doing, because it needs to be doing that in the first place and for the sake of its own interests. And that will mean focusing on greater responsibility, not only on burden shifting, also on capabilities, also on European centrality in NATO. We should be focusing on what we actually can control, because there's so many variables that we cannot predict, and in spite of the clarity in the language on Europe. And I think that's going to happen. I think it's going to happen in an environment where people seek not to fuel antagonisms that might enhance the risks or highlight the risks that come with the period of transition that we are in for.
Yeah, Emily, I just want to come back to Steve's question and ask what specifically will Europeans do? You've sort of alluded to some of that. I was impressed by an essay by Lawrence Friedman, the brilliant English commentator and international relations specialist, who said, it's not for Europe, it's not for governments to be provoked. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. It's going to be hard not to be provoked, especially when there are going to be lots of pesky reporters in the faces of the chancellor and prime ministers across the continent saying, how can you take this from a friend? Oh, you're muted again, Emily. Try again.
There's a
Yeah.
dilemma here, because calling out could alter the sense of urgency, which we actually need if we want to speed up and accelerate the transition that we need to tackle. Calling out policy differences and pushing back will alter the conversation that is to be had in the population. And that's necessary to turn things around, right? But at the same time, calling out policy differences will also highlight risks and will highlight exposure. And that can be exploited by other actors. So a sober stance on the policy differences, governments are not there to be provoked, as you said, could camouflage them and thus allow people to carry on in their comfort zones. I worry a bit about that.
Yeah. Steve, you had your finger up. Yeah.
Yeah, just a last comment, because I think where we are, and last comment on this, where we are brings us full circle here in kind of what has to be the 50,000 foot view of looking down at the strategy to question whether it will work, and we'll know in time. Can the aspirations of this strategy be reconciled with the means that lie within it? And on the issue of alliances, partners, and friends, the document at times seems schizophrenic. It refers to a founding debate in the United States of America, where the degree of American willingness to become entangled in the affairs of other countries was very much front of mind for our founding fathers. But then it leaps ahead to 1991, to the beginning of the post-Cold War era, and it skips over 150 years of American history and experience in the world, including the appeasement and the isolationism that preceded the most terrible conflagration in the world in the 20th century. Really, two of them, World War I and World War II. And so, there's a lot more American experience here than is represented in the document. I think another challenge, or a central challenge, will be reconciling the ambitions with the means. And here, my encouragement to Europe would be, do what you're going to do anyway because it's in your interest. Europe should build up its defense capabilities just as it intends to do. America's foreign policy will ultimately be guided by some combination of its values, its interests, and its capabilities. The interests don't change a whole lot from president to president. Even a presidency is dramatically different than its predecessor, like Trump versus Biden. But the interests will be a core driver. When America needs to act on its interests, they're laid out in some clarity in this document. For example, as has been cited, to prevent the rise of a hegemon within or over Europe, the United States is going to look for the capabilities that are there to do the job. If Europe is the party that has that capability, this will be a reinforcing element of a lasting U.S. partnership and alliance relationship with Europe. What is testing that proposition today, in the context of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, is that Europe wasn't available and the capabilities weren't there. And that has strained the common interest, to some extent, the values as well, but build the capabilities, Europe, and America is going to be a great ally and partner of Europe for the foreseeable future.
So thank you for that. I'm a little curious, though. The heat, the passionate opposition to the EU. Sitting in Europe, you might draw the conclusion that ultimately it's about a divide and conquer strategy, because the EU is actually what gives Europe heft, and the ability of the countries to bind together on trade and economic issues is what makes them a global player, which they're not yet militarily. And so I guess the question is, if Europe continues forward with the European project, how is that going, and makes itself stronger in all of its aspects, including military, how is that going to be received in Washington? I'm kind of curious what the opinion is here.
Well, I think that the document cites GDP figures and others to lament Europe's decline. I think the drafters of the document either themselves think or reflect the opinion that this has to do with sclerosis, overregulation, and a whole agenda that politically they disagree with. And I happen to personally, if I'm assessing what do I, Bill Woolford, think, I think you're right that a divide and conquer policy against the European Union, as it's again been rumored about this potentially classified versions spoke in far more dramatic terms about that issue. A policy of divide and conquer is doomed to make Europe weaker and thus worsen the security situation in the United States, to increase that problem of hegemony that we've been referring to. But I actually think they think that a military alliance of sovereign European states that are reinstating their fundamental Western civilizational commitments and are having big families and all the rest of it would be a far stronger deterrent to Russia and far more capable group than the current mamby-pamby European. I mean, I think European Union. I think there are people in the administration who genuinely believe that. I think the numbers, just very quickly, they kind of cooked the numbers in the document. They used PPP figures for the European share of global GDP in that section, but then used market exchange rate figures when they talked about the U.S. position. So there's a little bit of hyperbole there. But I think that's a conversation Europeans themselves are having. The European position has dramatically declined in the global scales of power over the last 20 years.
So we're
It's
coming
it's
to
it's
the very end, and I just want to give everyone 30 seconds to wrap up. Steve, why don't you go first?
okay. Just briefly on this point, it's pretty easy to pile on the European Union because one only needs to excerpt the quotes from Europeans criticizing the European Union to come up with the case. If the European Union acted on the Draghi plan, the criticisms would be significantly muted because there's so much evidence that is connected from social policies to immigration policies to economic policies here that it's almost a self-fulfilling critique that you can't be proven wrong on this one. European Union needs to reform. That's a simple reality that most all European leaders accept. Doing it is hard, but doing it will also, I think, change the dynamic. America, the document, it's not my document. I'm just analytically looking at it. The title of this section is to make Europe great again, and that's a great aspiration. But it's an aspiration that first and foremost should start with European leaders, not with America's advice from outside.
Emily.
Well, I agree that European needs to do a lot in terms of securing its own agility, its resilience, and tackling red tape. But I would also note that the national security strategy goes far beyond that by actually attacking democracies in Europe. That's not about European strength and making Europe great again. It's an attack on the essence of democracies, and that's a problem that will not be altered by rising GDPs, etc.
Mara, you have the last word.
So Churchill allegedly said, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally assess the results. And I think one theme that we've heard a lot throughout this last hour is that this strategy seems to be aligned in terms of what they're saying and what they're doing. So we should believe it. Thanks so much.
Agree.
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation. We're even going to end almost exactly when we said we would. I want to thank Steve, Emily, Mara, and Bill for your insights. It is our aspiration to try to add some value to these discussions whenever we can. And I'm delighted that so many people could join us tonight. What I didn't say at the beginning was that we had to switch platforms because so many people had signed up, several hundred. And we're delighted we can do this. This is undoubtedly, I think, our final Zoom of the year. We have one more local event here in Berlin, but we look forward to being joined by you again in the next semester. And we thank you for spending the last hour with us. And thanks again to these terrific panelists. Good night, one and all.